Okay, I now want to go through the Du Bois reading, and I know this one is kind of challenging, and most of you already posted on it and gotten through it. And if you want to adjust what you've written already, most of you do get the basic points of what he's talking about, of what Du Bois is doing. But I know a number of folks were struggling with him and not quite getting what he was after, and that's fine, because he is significantly more difficult to read than Washington is. Okay. And so if you want to go back and add to it after I've gone through this, that's perfectly fine. In fact, I encourage you to. Let me go through them for a bit, and I just want to make sure we all understand where we are with this unit. We're in the Civil Rights unit right now. And really quickly over the calendar. We should have just finished up the Du Bois reading and posted on it. So posted your summary. That was due on Friday. Let me get myself out of here. That you're just supposed to have summarized this. You should have finished the quiz. And start reading on the wells right now. So that's what you should be working on right now, is starting up the wells. But again, if you go through this and you want to revise possibly what you do on Du Bois, you can go ahead. So, and let me go through the Du Bois now and kind of give you an idea of what he's about. Let me move this over a little bit. And here's Du Bois. And again, he's of a mixed background, but you can see he's clearly, when he's recognized on the street. And I want to comment on a few other things with race and the nature of discrimination and other things that folks often confuse. Now, Du Bois is, if you trace his background, he's of a mixed white and black background. But when he's viewed and the way he's treated was as an African American, as a black American. And you can think of this in much the same way as Barack Obama was treated and viewed. He is of a mixed background. His mom was white and his dad was black. His dad is actually from Kenya, or was from Kenya. But he's always viewed as being black. And this is an important distinction to understand. The way you are treated and perceived by society can be dramatically different from your own background. And the way society treats you is different than what might come from your history and other things. So even though Du Bois is seen as being black, he does come from a mixed background. But the laws have a hard time dealing with this distinction and understanding it. So they would come up with complicated formulas of 1/8 and things like that. If your great-grandparents were, one of them was black, you were officially black, even if you could pass as white. Being able to pass as white was really troubling for some of the legal standards that went around at the time, because you can be perceived as white, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to classify you otherwise. So, again, so Du Bois did occupy both backgrounds, but would definitely be treated as one of them because he was essentially, recognizably African American. So another thing, and I've talked about a little bit, I've mentioned the terminology that he and Washington used with Negro. That is a dated term. So the better terms are African American or black. And there is a distinction between them. Just so folks know, African American refers to a distinct American background. If you are from, Haiti or something like that, or from, and we're going to come back to Haiti, or from Trinidad or something like that, you wouldn't be African American. You'd identify as black, or Afro-Caribbean or something like that. Or if you're from England, you'd be Anglo-African and things like that. So just so you know, those terms actually do have a distinction. For Americans, you can generally use black and African American interchangeably, but they do have distinction and difference. So let's go through Du Bois now. And again, Du Bois was born and raised and lived most of his life in the United States, but he did leave for Africa, for Ghana, when the civil rights movement was going on. He had essentially given up on America because of the racism that had gone on here. But he followed the movements of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King very closely. He did actually die on the day that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, so it was quite poignant. Around the turn of the century, there was still a hope that they could avoid the violence of and the discrimination of segregation, but it wasn't to happen. It would be a fight that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King would bring up. If you are aware of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's readings, their speeches and their writings, you are going to see echoes of Du Bois, not of Washington. So in their time period, Washington and Du Bois were the biggest figures. But when you get to influence, let me move this over a little bit, and influence down time, Du Bois has been a far more important figure, not just within African Americans, but within other movements for civil rights. And I'll try to show you why. Because of the way he figures and posits civil rights. And this is what we want to go after and try to get to before we get to Wells. Okay, so let me go through this. Now this is was from his book, The Souls of Black Folks, which came out around 1905 in response to many of the speeches and the essays of Washington. Oops, let me jump back a little bit. Now he's got a quotation from Byron. I should admit, even though I'm an English professor, I'm not as familiar with Byron. Very sophisticated romantic poet. And Romanticism, by the way, was a movement not so much about love. In fact, it was rarely about love, but was about ideals of individualism and what the human mind can do and what the human spirit can do. The American Declaration of Independence is a quintessential romantic document with the idea that all men are created equal. That is a romantic notion. And so when Du Bois quotes Byron, he's quoting one of the great poets of the Romantic time period. Okay, that's what he's doing. I won't get so much into the Byron here. Let's jump into the essay itself. But I just want you to see that he's positioning himself within an intellectual context, within the context of Romanticism. And let me actually get rid of myself here, and we'll just stick with Du Bois. And he starts off with, easily the most striking thing in in the history of the American Negro since 1876. Now, most of you guys should have something triggering in your mind, 1776. In other words, 100 years since the Revolution. Du Bois wants you to have that in mind, that there's been another moment here, 100 years precisely since the Revolution. Is the ascendancy of Mr. Booker T. Washington. This is probably one of the most amazing things in 100 years. It began at the time when war memories and ideals were rapidly passing. In other words, about a decade after the Civil War had ended. A day of astonishing commercial development was dawning. Things were taking off economically. A sense of doubt and hesitation overtook the freedmen's sons. By freedmen's sons, he means the people who were born to the people who were freed as slaves. So freedmen would be somebody who was born a slave but got freed. That's what he's referring to here. Now I know this can sometimes be a little bit more difficult because his vocabulary requires a historical background that many folks wouldn't be familiar with, and I'm going to try to give you some context of it. Then it was that his leading began. So he comes into being in the decades after the Civil War. So he's talking about in the decades since 1876. Okay, that's when he came into his leadership. And now he's dealing with people who are not necessarily born into slavery, but were the children of slaves. That's what we're talking about here. Mr. Washington came with a simple, definite program of the psychological moment when the nation was a little ashamed of having bestowed so much sentiment on Negroes and was concentrating its energies on dollars. So what he's doing is stopping you there and saying this is when he's coming along. But in other words, money and economic development is at the center rather than worrying so much about civil rights. As many people are looking at it, blacks are now freed. Why should we worry about it? We've got business to take care of. And I want to give a little aside here. I did this with Washington too. Du Bois's writing is absolutely stunning. You should try to listen to it at certain times. He uses alliteration and parallels in a way that is absolutely stunning. I do consider him the best nonfiction writer in American history. Washington is definitely one of the best too. But some of this writing, if you just listen to it, is absolutely magnificent. But I won't go into that much here. So he's saying Washington comes along at a time period when things are dramatically shifting in the United States. They're now thinking, I'm not going to worry so much about the rights of blacks. That was something we did decades ago. Let's not worry about it now. Okay, you might think about the crises that were going on in the 80s are now past and not worth worrying about. We've got a different time period. How some people might see the crises that happened from the Vietnam War and things like that. That war is past, and people just want to move on from it. But Mr. Washington first and indissolubly linked these things. He put enthusiasm, unlimited energy, and perfect faith into his program and changed it from a bypath into a veritable way of life. And by the way, again, this is magnificent paralleling. And what Washington is doing better than anybody else that ever came before is putting it all together. This enthusiasm, energy, and faith. It is a religious faith that Washington has. That this is not just a faith in God, but it's a faith running through his teachings that he's got it right. And change it from a bypath to a veritable way of life. This is how you need to live your life. If we're to understand this at all, we do know, certain people today put religion and, methods of life together. Not just based on religion, but on how to, live your life in a prosperous way. That's what he was doing. Okay, and he was doing it in this time period when civil rights are passing and aren't as important. But again, it's simultaneously, things are going to start getting ugly for African Americans. And what Du Bois says is this is fascinating, and it's worth looking at how he did this. Okay, so watch this paragraph. This is probably puts Washington together better than just about anybody can. To gain sympathy and cooperation of the various elements comprising the white South was Mr. Washington's first task. And in this, at a time when Tuskegee was founded, seemed for a black man well nigh impossible. So when Washington starts, and he founds Tuskegee, this seemed impossible, something that people could not do. He founds a university for training African Americans in the trades of carpentry, bricklaying, and basic engineering that's necessary. That seemed impossible. He got it done. Okay, and he got the sympathy of the South when it seemed impossible. Not only the North given up, but the South had given up on African Americans. And this man comes along and gets Tuskegee founded. Du Bois has enormous respect for Washington, and that always has to be kept in mind, that he sees in Washington somebody who gets stuff done when others failed. And that's never to be forgotten about Du Bois's view of Washington. And he says, and yet 10 years later on, it was done. And the words spoken at Atlanta, and this is a famous quotation from Washington, in all things purely social, we can be as separate as the 5 fingers, and yet one in hand, as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. What he's saying there, and let me come back in. I know this might seem simple and silly. Let me go full screen. We can be separate like the fingers of your hand. We can separate whites and blacks, Mexicans, any Asians, all groups. But we can work together to get things done. That's what he's saying. So we can be separate, segregated, but working together economically. That's what he's doing. It's a simple metaphor, but it's profound because what he's doing is justifying segregation in that simple metaphor. Let's cooperate and get things done, even if we keep ourselves distinct the whole time. That's what he thinks can happen. There can be economic cooperation, but segregation of the different groups. This Atlanta Compromise is by all odds the most notable thing in Mr. Washington's career. It interpreted it in different ways. The radicals received it as a complete surrender of the demand for civil and social political equality. The conservatives as a generously conceived working basis for mutual understanding. So both groups saw it differently. So both approved it, and today its author is certainly the most distinguished Southerner since Jefferson Davis, and the one with the largest personal following. That is a horrendous level of irony. It's what Du Bois engages in, and a lot of people miss it. Jefferson Davis was the first president of the South when the South broke from the North and started the Civil War. So you have the most famous Southerner since the beginning of the Civil War, the one who tried to preserve slavery, is now ironically an African American, not the one trying to lead the South's rebellion. That's his understatement in his rebellion, but it's also very true. Washington is an incredibly powerful and famous figure at this time period, and it's ironic that he's now the best known Southerner. No other Southerner is as well known as he is. Okay. And these are the types of things that Du Bois picks up on, and he's absolutely shockingly insightful with them. But that's a case of his irony. And then watch this. And so thoroughly did he learn the speech and thought of triumphant commercialism and the ideals of material prosperity, that the picture of a lone black boy poring over French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities. One wonders what Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi would say to this. I do need to point out his use of alliteration here. One wonders what Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi would say to this. He does it in such a subtle way, along with the parallels. It just makes his writing magnificent. Of course, St. Francis of Assisi is the one who's known as being the saint for animals and actually gave up his wealth to live among the poor. He founded the Franciscan friars. And Socrates was a famous Greek figure dedicated to doing what, knowing yourself above all things. Of course, poring over a French grammar amongst the weeds to Washington was an abomination. Put the book down, get the yard cleaned up, get to work. That's what Washington would say, clearly. And Washington makes an allusion to that in the reading that we have. That he sees, that kind of education and French grammar as being absolutely worthless. What Du Bois is pointing out is that you should be able to educate yourself according to your own darn concerns, and who cares what anybody else thinks about it. And this is a difficult point for many people to handle, because many people want to think, oh, good, be practical. But Du Bois is very clear. You should be able to do as you damn well please. Washington says, yes, you should be, but come on over here and get to work. That's what he's doing consistently. Consistently, he does that. He says, we need to take care of the economic concerns first and lay the foundation for later on. Du Bois is saying, like hell, we can do whatever we think we need as important as individuals, and it's our own darn business. He's not giving up on the economic ideas, but he's saying you shouldn't give up on the higher ideals simultaneously. Okay, so that's part of it, and Du Bois is going to say there shouldn't be any compromise. Okay, and that's a famous quotation from Du Bois, by the way. So you can see both of them, and I want everybody to get this. There is no middle ground on this, but both of these men do respect the other views. But I don't want you taking the middle ground, because it really can't be done. Du Bois is saying you must have civil rights. You must be able to educate yourself according to how you are able to educate yourself and what you think is important constantly. Okay, Washington is saying yes, but let's work on the foundation first. Okay, when he gets into this, he starts talking about the criticism of the North, and I'll jump up ahead a little bit. Usually, however, such criticism has not found open expression. Although, too, the spiritual sons of the abolitionists have not been prepared to acknowledge that the schools founded before Tuskegee by men of broad ideals and self-sacrificing spirit were wholly failures and worthy of ridicule. That's where he's pointing out that Washington gets things done. The man is successful. Tuskegee shows that abundantly clearly, that he got it done, that ideals fail often. And what Du Bois is trying to do is differentiate himself from people who have high ideals and no actual practical abilities. So Du Bois is trying to claim that he is practical and does not want to be lumped in with other people who have ideals but can't get stuff done. Watch what he does here as we jump down ahead. And let me get rid of myself again. There, I like that better. Stern financial and social stress after the war cooled much of the previous humanitarian ardor. The disappointment and impatience of the Negroes and the persistence of slavery and serfdom voiced itself in two movements. The slaves of the South, undoubtedly by vague rumors of the Haitian revolt, Remember what Washington did with the Haitian Revolt, when he talked about Haitians getting well educated but absolutely useless once they got all their education. Made 3 fierce attempts at insurrection: in 1800 under Gabriel in Virginia, in 1822 under Vesey in Carolina, and 1831 in Virginia under the terrible Nat Turner. Haitian revolts, Haiti to Washington was a source of ridicule of people of blacks being educated in ways that aren't practical. What Du Bois is pointing out is that Haiti has played a very different role in American history. It inspired black Americans to revolt violently against their white enslavers repeatedly. That's what it did. And I need to make this very clear because people misunderstand Du Bois. Du Bois is pointing out that violent revolution is often necessary, and it works. It gets people to back off. And please keep in mind that the United States was founded not on a nonviolent movement. The Revolutionary War was violent. Okay? It was armed insurrection against the British. And what Du Bois is pointing out is that black Americans were also watching Haitians and learning from it. Washington wipes that out. And then what you have here is a social movement. In Philadelphia, this is in the churches. When the blacks weren't being recognized, they broke away and set up black churches. So blacks, by not being recognized, are actually establishing independence within the North. And that was a religious movement within the North in the African church. That's the AME, African Methodist churches, and others were breaking away. By 1830, slavery seemed hopelessly fashioned in the South, and slaves thoroughly cowed in submission. Excuse me. The free Negroes of the North, inspired by the mulatto immigrants of the West Indies, began to change the basis of their demands. They recognized the slavery of the slaves, but insisted that they themselves were freemen, and sought amalgamation with the nation on terms with other men. So in other words, we're going to compromise. That is what Washington does, as he compromises. And he goes through the history of compromise, which is it doesn't work out. So that was part of a history right before the Civil War. And then he gets into this other period of self-assertion. Here, led by Raymond, Nell, Wells Brown, Douglass, a new period of self-assertion and self-development dawned. To be sure, ultimate freedom and assimilation was the ideal before the leaders, but the assertion of manhood rights by the Negro by himself was the main reliance, and John Brown's raid was the extreme of this logic. I want to stop it here to make sure it's clear that Du Bois sees himself in line with this history. Now, Douglass himself was not advocating open violence, but John Brown's raid was. And what Du Bois is doing is connecting Douglass's assertion of self-rights and self-development with John Brown's raid, which in other words is a violent attack to assert African American rights. Du Bois himself was not violent, but he clearly shows that violence does lead to people backing off and allowing people to live free. So he does not wipe out the importance of violence to assert and preserve rights. Again, a lot of people don't like to think about this, but the reality is America is founded on violence. A violent revolt from Britain. And so what Du Bois is doing is not getting rid of, even though he was not violent, he wants to make it clear, violence is part of self-assertion. He's not talking about mob rule. He's talking about very real violence to assert African Americans' rights. Okay? But what he points out about Washington is that he was compromising, but Booker T. Washington arose as essentially a leader, not of one race, but of two. A compromiser between the South, the North, and the Negro. Naturally, the Negro resented, at first bitterly, signs of compromise, which surrendered their civil and political rights, even though this was to be exchanged for larger chances of economic development. So you get some resentment among the African Americans, but many of the North and in the South kind of like it. They're willing to compromise. But watch what happens. This is where Du Bois gets more practical. This is in paragraph 16. In answer to this, it has been claimed that the Negro can survive only through submission. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that black people give up, at least for the present, 3 things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education and acclimation of wealth, and a conciliation of the South. That's what he sees Washington's program as. Give up political rights, don't insist on your civil rights, and don't worry about getting a higher education. In other words, those Bell letters that Washington talked about. What Du Bois points out, and this is where he's being practical, is that what's happened is instead of getting, laying a foundation, the exact opposite is happening. Instead, blacks are sliding backwards. They're not getting a foundation. You're getting the disenfranchisement of the Negro. In other words, they're losing their votes. The legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro. This is distinctly new in American history. This passage of Jim Crow laws and segregation is new since 1876. It did not exist before then. The Ku Klux Klan was founded after the Civil War, not before. And so what's happening by following Washington's program of compromise is that African Americans are falling back further and further socially. The steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for higher training of Negroes. In other words, the schools that Washington is founding are losing out more and more so. And then he gets to the 3 problems that exist within Washington. And these are all practical problems. So I really want to distinguish Du Bois from people who are of, as he accuses, of high ideals. He sees himself as being very practical, not theoretical. So he sees these 3 problems with Washington. And I want to kind of run ahead because I'm running out of time here. He sees the answer to be 3 different things. You insist upon the right to vote and upon civic equality in the education of youth according to ability. In other words, he does not want all African Americans taught in French grammar or, American poetry. He gets it. He knows this is not the calling of everyone. But the education of the youth in poetry and other things is not why African Americans are falling behind. That's not the issue. African Americans need their political rights in order to preserve their economic gains. So he sees himself as being entirely practical, not abstract, not theoretical. Washington emphasizes his own practicality, but Du Bois is saying that these ideas of civil rights have very practical import. Then he goes through the rest of it and shows a number of problems with it, and he really argues it forcefully. What I want you to be able to do is really consider both writers and see what you think is really what can and should be done. What I want you, and I want to be very adamant about this, I don't want you to come into today's issues that we're seeing with civil rights, Black Lives Matter, and other things, and whether or not, Trump is this or that with civil rights and with African Americans. I want you not to come into today's issues. Now, does this have, does this shed light on today's issues? Yes, it does. That's not what we're going to do with this essay, however. What we're going to do is come up to, and I really want to keep emphasizing this, come up to the writings of Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is a journalist writing in the time period about the lynchings and other things that are going on. I want you to keep and consider both Washington and Du Bois very carefully and what they're writing about. And it's the nature of how civil rights plays out. And in light of Wells, whom do you think works better? And you need to really read Wells. And she's going to get into the really dirty history of this terrorizing the African American community with lynchings and other things. And this is something that's been really forgotten. Wells, by the way, has been brought up in the New York Times more recently, and I'm so glad it has been. Maybe I can find it really quickly. And she's coming back, and I've found her years ago, and I've looked into her and found her to be one of the most striking sources. Let's see if we can find her. Yeah, she's actually coming back in, and this is magnificent that she's coming back in and being rediscovered. But she's writing about, the lynchings that were going on and how they were terrorizing the community and the effect they have in a very real way. And it's not just about, and this is something I mentioned last week, with the terrorist act against the Jewish community, the synagogues in Pittsburgh. And I hope this doesn't sound mean or cold, but it wasn't just about the 11 lives lost, as terrible as that was. It's about the effect that this terrorism has on everybody else, and the effect that terrorism has on a community that's been attacked. And when you look at the synagogues that were attacked, that spreads terror throughout the Jewish community. There was a magnificent piece at the Washington Post on how the Jews were attacked because they were Jews, not because of religion, but because they were Jews. And that spreads terror throughout the community, and that's very important to keep in mind, especially in light of what we learned about the Holocaust. These people were attacked because they were Jewish. Now, when we look at the civil rights movement, I want you to consider that these people were being attacked because they're African Americans, and the effect that has on the community, okay, on the black community. What I don't want you to do is compress different issues of discrimination. We can go through issues of discrimination against Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans. We can go through all these different types. I don't want you to conflate them. That's false equivalency. That's one of the critical thinking terms I want you to understand, is equivocating or causing, seeing different issues that are radically different as being the same. They're not. I want you to always understand each issue on its own terms. In this case, I want you to understand what was going on with the lynchings in this time period. And then think about whether or not you think Washington's approach or Du Bois's approach works best. So get done with the Du Bois, get that all posted and everything, get done with the Wells. Keep Washington and Du Bois in mind as you're reading through this. Who's the better way to go? Okay? And what you're going to be doing is getting one paragraph from Washington, one from Du Bois, one from Washington, one from Du Bois, and bringing up Wells in each one of the body paragraphs. So you can go Washington, Du Bois, Washington, Du Bois, or you can go Du Bois, Washington, Du Bois, Washington, as you write this essay. But you shouldn't really know how you stand until you get through the Wells. You shouldn't really know. Okay? I'll leave it there. Keep going at this, guys. I will have, hopefully, and I apologize, I'm behind on the grading. Your grades have been posted for the Shoah essays. I hope to get the videos out later tomorrow on Tuesday. And so you can have that before you start on the civil rights essay. Okay? All right. Take care.